World War First facts. Natural kids travel back in time to find out more about a conflict that rocked the world. On July 28, 1914, began the outbreak of the First World War, called World War I or the Great War for Civilization. Join us as we learn everything there is to know in our World War the First facts. Why did it start? 100 years might seem like a very long time ago, but it isn't really. Your great-great-grandparents were around then, and they would have lived through, and maybe even taking part in, this terrible conflict. Lots of history books have been written on World War I facts and why it started, but it all boils down to the fact that Europe had split into two large families of countries, the Allies, the British Empire, France, Belgium, Russia, and later, the USA, were in one family, and the Central Powers of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey was in the other. On the 4th August 1914, Germany invaded Belgium, and so, standing by its promise to seek up for Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany. The world was at war. How long did World War I last? When the First World War began this summer, most people thought it would be over by Christmas. Many believed that Britain was so powerful it could win very quickly. In fact, the First World War lasted 4 terrible years, not 4 months. Life in the trenches in World War I. Here's the pictures that soldiers in the trenches would spend their days doing chores, firing on the enemy, playing cards, and riding gliders home. Incredibly, 9 of the 10 men survived. By the winter of 1915, the opposing sides had both dug long ditches called trenches which faced each other, in some places just 30 meters apart. These lines of narrow trenches stretched from the Belgian coast to Switzerland and were known as the Western Front. Over 5 million British soldiers spent time living in these muddy, miserable ditches, taking it in turns to be on the front line, the trench closest to the enemy. Day to day, life there was smelly and grim. There were millions of giant rats, overflowing latrines, loose and terrible lice infestations, not to mention the dead bodies. Every so often, soldiers on the front line would be instructed to leave their trench and venture into dangerous no man's land, the area between the sides, to try to push back the enemy. Did you know, during Christmas 1914, some German and British soldiers agreed to stop fighting each other for a day or two? They chatted, sang, and even played football together. A new type of war. This war was very different from conflicts of the past. For the first time, powerful new weapons and vehicles were used at sea, on land, and in the air, resulting in many people being killed or wounded. In Britain, you could sometimes hear what sounded like thunder coming across the English Channel from Europe. In fact, it was the huge room of big guns called artillery being fired on the Western Front. 55% of the men who died in World War I were killed by the artillery. The largest battle of the World War I, the Battle of the Somme, is known as one of the bloodiest battles in history. It was fought by the French and British against the Germans on both sides of the River Somme in France and lasted for more than 5 months. Over 1 million men were killed or wounded, and was the first time that a tank was used in combat. Animals during World War I. Both on the battlefield and back at home, some incredible creatures helped to transport soldiers and goods and save lives. Almost 1 million horses were involved in the war. Soldiers on horseback were known as the cavalry, and horses also pulled some of the gigantic guns, ambulances, and supply wagons. Gas from the horse droppings could even be used to power lamps. British families gave their pet dogs to the army so that they could carry messages in special tubes on their collars. Dogs were fast, difficult to shoot at, and they also caught rats. Pet pigeons were drafted in to carry messages over long distances, often carrying news from the front line back to Britain. Germans trained hawks to kill any carrier pigeons they saw. Goldfish did their bit too. After gas attacks, the gas masses were washed and rinsed, and if the rising water killed a goldfish that were placed in it, that meant the mass still had poison on them. What was life like in Britain during World War I? Just because you weren't in the battle doesn't mean you weren't in the danger zone. Back on the home front, Britain was under attack from all sides. These enormous Chaplin airships dropped bombs on ordinary people's homes. It was the first time in history that Britain had come under threat from the sky. Gigantic German airships, known as Chaplins, below, carried out 52 bombing raids on Britain during the war, killing more than 500. People were terrified of them. To avoid Chaplin attacks, no lines could be used after sunset and loud noises were banned too. Large-scale bombing raids on British cities were carried out during the day by German biplanes called Gothas. There were threats from the sea, too. Scarborough, Hartlepool, and Whitby was the first seaside town to be shelled by the German Navy. Battlecruisers, ships with huge guns, launched a surprise attack on 16 December 1914. 137 people were killed and 592 injured that night alone. People from across the Britain were urged to fight. But all these attacks on ordinary people only stirred up hatred against the enemy, encouraging more British men to volunteer and fight for their countries against the beast. At the start of the war, there was just 350,000 men in the British Army, but by 1970, there were 3.5 million. Mind you, in 1916, conscription came in, a rule that said all healthy men aged from 18 to 41 had to fight.